Hey y'all, it is Tuesday, April 14th, and today I am going to try my very best to make this video shorter than yesterday. So instead of spending so much time on our word of the day and our skill of the day, I'm just going to talk about it briefly and maybe show you a picture, and then we're going to move on to discuss what happened in chapter 2 and go on to chapter 3 of Number the Stars. Okay, so our word today is swastika. And swastika is a emblem or symbol that the Nazi political party used on their flags and for their army to show their allegiance to Hitler and his dictatorship. So I'm going to turn this around so that you guys can see. This is a swastika. This right here is the symbol that is used for the Nazi political party. And this is a picture of a Nazi flag. So it would have been all red background with the white circle and then the crossed arms that make up the swastika symbol. And you probably remember seeing that on the slideshow of the Holocaust when I showed you the propaganda, the posters that Hitler had created to kind of get people to turn against the Jewish religion and make people want to be a part of the Nazi party. And he made all those posters with the Nazi symbol, the swastika, look great and wonderful and happy, while all the other posters looked kind of sad and dark and everything else. So that's a swastika. It is a symbol or emblem that the Nazis used to show their allegiance to Hitler. Swastika can be used in your ABC book. You could put that as an S. There are other S's that you could use as well. Nazi could be used in your ABC book, so you could do N for Nazi, just a heads up on that. All right. Our skill today is predicting, and what you are going to be doing on your exit ticket is making a prediction. So based on chapters 1, 2, and the chapter we read today, 3, you are going to make a prediction. Predicting means you are kind of forecasting the future. You're saying what you think is going to happen next. A little bit different than inferencing, where you use the clues to determine what's happening right now. Prediction, you're using the clues to say, this is what I think is going to happen, either in the next chapter or at the end of the book or at some point in the book. Chapter 1, we learned the setting. We met some of the characters. In chapter 2, it just kind of continued on with these characters a little bit. And it did tell us a little bit more about the setting, because we found out that Kirsty and Anne-Marie share a room, which would not be uncommon in 1943 especially, but even in an apartment in Copenhagen today, it's entirely possible that siblings share rooms. You may even share a room with a sibling now, and that's not uncommon either. So Kirsty asked Anne-Marie to tell her a bedtime story, and Anne-Marie made up a story about a king and a queen and a princess named Kirsten. So she kind of used Kirsty's name as part of the princess in the story. And what she was doing as she was telling the story and Kirsty falls asleep is she has a flashback. And she flashes back to when she was 7 years old. So this was 3 years earlier, and the Nazis had just come into Denmark. And her dad was telling this story about how a Nazi soldier didn't even know who their king was, and asked a young boy who was standing on the corner, who is the man that rides by on this horse every day? And the horse's name was Jubilee. And he says, oh, well, that's King Christian X. That's our king. And the Nazi soldier was shocked. Like, what? He doesn't have a bodyguard? I mean, think about that. Imagine President Trump even just getting in a car and driving around without a bodyguard or without some kind of security detail. It wouldn't happen. It doesn't happen in many countries at all. But in Denmark at that time, in 1943, the king had no problem getting on his horse and just riding around town and waving at his people. And the people all loved him, to the point where this young teenager says to this Nazi soldier, well, we're all his bodyguard, meaning we're all here to protect him. And that was kind of a powerful moment in the book, in that these people are very dedicated to their king. And not only are these people dedicated to their king, but their king is dedicated to them as well. Because Anne-Marie goes on to ask her dad, like, Dad, why didn't he fight the Nazis? Why didn't he try to stop this from happening, Nazi occupation, the Nazis coming into the country? And her father gives such an amazing answer, and it's the truth. And it was that he felt it was more important to, and by he, I mean King Christian X, felt that it was more important to surrender or give up than to fight, because their army was so small and he knew that they would have been destroyed. So instead of losing Danish lives, he decided just to surrender and try to stick this thing out and stay as positive as possible. So he continued to ride around Denmark until he actually fell off his horse and became ill and injured. And everyone thought that he was going to pass, but he didn't end up passing on. He lived. So that's where we are now. We have definitely a setting. We have some connections to characters. And today we're moving on to chapter 3. And chapter 3 is called, Where is Mrs. Hirsch? Okay, so you can follow along with me. If you pause this video, you can bring up the PDF and do split screens so that you can watch my video and listen to the story as I'm reading and follow along on the PDF version of Number the Stars. So pause the video now if you would like. Otherwise, you're going to sit back and relax and try to take this all in. Where is Mrs. Hirsch? The days of September passed one after the other, much the same. Anne-Marie and Ellen walked to school together and home again, always now taking the longer way, avoiding the tall soldier and his partner. Kirsty dawdled just behind them or scampered ahead, never out of their sight. So that's making reference to chapter 1 when they were running down the sidewalk and Mrs. Rosen said, don't do that anymore, go the other way so that you're not seen. The two mothers still had their coffee together in the afternoons. They began to knit mittens as the days grew slightly shorter and the first leaves began to fall from the trees. Because another winter was coming. Everyone remembered the last one. There was no fuel now for their homes and apartments in Copenhagen, and the winter nights were terribly cold. Like the other families in their building, the Johansons had opened the old chimney and installed a little stove to use for heat when they could find coal to burn. Mama used it too sometimes for cooking, because electricity was rationed now. At night, they used candles for light. Sometimes Ellen's father, a teacher, complained in frustration because he could see in the dim light, he couldn't see in the dim light to correct his students' papers. Okay, so time out. Electricity is rationed. So rationed means that they only give out enough to be used at certain times or enough to be used for a certain time period. So what happened when Nazi soldiers would occupy a country? They would come into that country and they would only give the people of that country things that they thought they needed to survive. But sometimes what they needed to survive was given to them just barely. So they were only given electricity during certain times of day. It was rationed. That means it could only be used during certain times. And then they, just like the coffee was rationed, they really didn't get coffee. They really didn't even get tea. So that was another thing that Hitler would kind of rule by intimidation. He would try to intimidate people and scare people. So he would take a lot of the things that they enjoyed or they liked or made life kind of better and easier for them. He would take it away from them. And then fuel was also even taken away. So imagine you don't have heat or you only have heat during certain times of the day, even in the winter. And Denmark's winters are very much like ours, if not even a little colder than ours because they're further north than we are. So she's kind of remembering this last winter when it was so freezing and they only had light during certain times of the day. And when they weren't able to use the electricity to give them light, they had to use candles. And they had to bundle up with mittens and hats and blankets and everything else because they didn't have the fuel that they needed to stay as warm as they would like to stay. Soon, we will have to add another blanket to your bed, Mama said one morning as she and Anne-Marie tidied the bedroom. Kirsty and I are lucky to have each other for warmth in the winter, Anne-Marie said. Poor Ellen, to have no sisters. She will have to snuggle in with her Mama and Papa when it gets cold, Mama said, smiling. I remember when Kirsty slept between you and Papa. She was supposed to stay in her crib, but in the middle of the night, she would climb out and get in with you," Anne-Marie said, smoothing the pillows on the bed. Then she hesitated and glanced at her mother, fearful that she had said the wrong thing, the thing that would bring the pained look to her mother's face. The days when little Kirsty slept in Mama and Papa's room were the days when Lise and Anne-Marie shared this bed. So this is before Lise had passed away in her accident. Her and Anne-Marie shared the bedroom. But then as she grew older and was going to get married and move out, but then ended up actually passing away, now Kirsty is in bed with them. So it brought a pained look to her mom's face because her mom was still sad about losing her daughter, I'm sure. But Mama was laughing quietly. "Oh, I remember too," she said. "Sometimes she wet the bed in the middle of the night." "I did not," Kirsty said haughtily from the bedroom doorway. "I never ever did that." Mama, still laughing, knelt and kissed Kirsty on the cheek. "Time to leave for school, girls," she said. She began to button Kirsty's jacket. "Oh, dear," she said suddenly. "Look, this button has broken right in half. Anne-Marie, take Kirsty with you after school today to the little shop where Mrs. Hirsch sells thread and buttons. See if you can buy just one to match the others on her jacket. I'll give you some crooner. It shouldn't cost very much." But after school, when the girls stopped at the shop, which had been there as long as Anne-Marie could remember, they found it closed. There was a new padlock on the door and a sign, but the sign was in German. They couldn't read the words. "Well, I wonder if Mrs. Hirsch is sick," Anne-Marie said as they walked away. "Well, I saw her on Saturday," Ellen said. "She was with her husband and their son. They all looked just fine. Or at least the parents looked just fine. The son always looks like a horror," she giggled. Anne-Marie made a face. The Hirsch family lived in the neighborhood, so they had seen the boy, Samuel, often. He was a tall teenager with thick glasses, stooped shoulders, and unruly hair. He rode a bicycle to school, leaning forward and squinting, wrinkling his nose to nudge his glasses into place. His bicycle had wooden wheels, now that rubber wasn't available, so no rubber for tires. So this is another one of those things that was taken away by the Nazi soldiers. And it creaked and clattered on the street. "I think the Hirsches all went on a vacation to the seashore," Kirsty announced. And I suppose they took a big basket of pink frosted cupcakes with them," Anne-Marie said sarcastically to her sister. "Yes, I suppose they did," Kirsty replied. Anne-Marie and Ellen exchanged looks that meant Kirsty is so dumb. No one in Copenhagen had taken a vacation to the seashore since the war began. There were no pink frosted cupcakes. There hadn't been for months. Still, Anne-Marie thought, looking back at the shop before they turned the corner, where was Mrs. Hirsch? The Hirsch family had gone somewhere. Why else would they close the shop? Mama was troubled when she heard the news. "Are you sure?" she asked several times. "We can find another button someplace," Anne-Marie reassured her, "or we can take one from the bottom of the jacket and move it up. It won't show very much." But it didn't seem to be the jacket that worried Mama. "Are you sure the sign was in German?" she asked again. "Maybe you didn't look carefully." "Mama, it had a swastika on it." Her mother turned away with a distracted look. "Anne-Marie, watch your sister for a few moments and begin to peel the potatoes for dinner. I'll be right back." "Well, where are you going?" Anne-Marie asked as her mother started for the door. "I want to talk to Mrs. Rosen." Puzzled, Anne-Marie watched her mother leave the apartment. She went to the kitchen and opened the door to the cupboard where the potatoes were kept. Every night now, it seemed, they had potatoes for dinner and very little else. So this would have been another thing. Even food would have been rationed, so they could only have certain foods because there was only so many foods available to them. Anne-Marie was almost asleep when there was a light knock on the bedroom door. Candlelight appeared as the door opened, and her mother stepped in. "Are you asleep, Anne-Marie?" "No, why? Is something wrong?" Nothing's wrong, but I'd like you to get up and come out to the living room. Peter's here. Papa and I want to talk to you. So remember, Peter Nielsen is the man who was engaged to Lise. And he also is the one who comes for visits, but the visits don't last very long. He kind of does not linger, so he doesn't really stay. So she's waking her up as Anne-Marie is almost asleep so that she'll come out and talk to Peter and talk to Mom and Dad. Anne-Marie jumped out of bed and Kirsty grunted in her sleep. Peter? She hadn't seen him in a long time. There was something frightening about his being here at night. Copenhagen had a curfew, and no citizens were allowed out after 8 o'clock. It was very dangerous, she knew, for Peter to visit at this time, but she was delighted that he was here. Though his visits were always very hurried, they almost seemed secret somehow, in a way she couldn't quite put her finger on. Still, it was a treat to see Peter. It brought back memories of happier times, and her parents loved Peter too. They said he was like a son. Barefoot, she ran into the living room and into Peter's arms. He grinned, kissed her cheek, and ruffled her long hair. Why, you've grown taller since I saw you last, he told her. You're all legs. Anne-Marie laughed. I won the girls' foot race last Friday at school, she told him proudly. Where have you been? We've missed you. Oh, my work takes me all over, Peter explained. Look, I brought you something, one for Kirsty, too. He reached into his pocket and handed her 2 seashells. Anne-Marie put the smaller one on the table to save it for her sister. She held the other in her hands, turning it in the light, looking at the rigid, pearly surface. It was so like Peter to bring just the right gift. For your Mama and Papa, I brought something more practical, 2 bottles of beer. Mama and Papa smiled and raised their glasses. Papa took a sip and wiped the foam from his upper lip. Then his face became more serious. Anne-Marie, he said, Peter tells us that the Germans have issued orders closing many stores run by Jews. Jews? Anne-Marie repeated. Is Mrs. Hirsch Jewish? Is that why the button shop is closed? Why have they done that? Peter leaned forward. It is their way of tormenting. For some reason, they want to torment Jewish people. It has happened in other countries. They have taken their time here. They have let us relax a little. But now it seems to be starting. But why the button shop? What harm is a button shop? Mrs. Hirsch is such a nice lady, even Samuel. I mean, he's a dope, but he would never harm anyone. How could he? He can't even see with his thick glasses. Then Anne-Marie thought of something else. If they can't sell their buttons, how will they earn a living? Friends will take care of them, Mama said gently. That's what friends do. Anne-Marie nodded. Mama was right, of course. Friends and neighbors would go to the home of the Hirsch family and would take them fish and potatoes and bread and herbs for making tea. Maybe Peter would even take them a beer. They would be comfortable until their shop was allowed to open again. Then suddenly she sat upright, her eyes wide. Mama, she said. Papa, the Rosens are Jewish. Her parents nodded, their faces serious and drawn. I talked to Sophie Rosen this afternoon after you told me about the button shop, Mama said. She knows what is happening, but she doesn't think that it will affect them. Anne-Marie thought and understood. She relaxed. Mr. Rosen doesn't have a shop. He's a teacher. They can't close a whole school. She looked at Peter with a question in her eyes. Can they? I think the Rosens will be all right, he said. But you keep an eye on your friend Ellen and stay away from the soldiers. Your mother told me about what happened on Ostra Brigade. Anne-Marie shrugged. She had almost forgotten the incident. Oh, it was nothing. They were only bored and looking for someone to talk to, I think. She turned to her father. Papa, do you remember what you heard the boy say to the soldier? That all of Denmark would be the king's bodyguard? Her father smiled. I have never forgotten it, he said. Well, Anne-Marie said slowly, now I think that all of Denmark must be bodyguards for the Jews as well. So we shall, Papa replied. Peter stood. I must go, he said. And you, Longlegs, it is way past your bedtime now. He hugged Anne Marie again. Later, once more in her bed beside the warm cocoon of her sister, Anne Marie remembered how her father had said 3 years before that he would die to protect the king, that her mother would too. And Anne Marie, even at 7 years old, had announced proudly that she would also. Now she was 10 with long legs and no more silly dreams of pink frosted cupcakes. And now she and all of the Danes were to be bodyguard for Ellen and Ellen's parents and all of Denmark's Jews. Would she die to protect them? Truly? Anne Marie was honest enough to admit there in the darkness to herself that she wasn't sure. For a moment she felt frightened, but she pulled the blanket up higher around her neck and relaxed. It was all imaginary anyway, not real. It was only in fairy tales that people were called upon to be so brave to have to die for one another, not in real-life Denmark. Oh, there were soldiers, that was true, and the courageous resistance leaders, who sometimes lost their lives, that was true too. But ordinary people, like the Rosens and the Johansons, Anne Marie admitted to herself, snuggling there in the quiet dark, that she was glad to be an ordinary person who would never be called upon for such courage. And that's the end of chapter 3. So tomorrow you're going to do the exit ticket, which asks you to make a prediction, and I'm sure you can imagine where that's going. What do you think is going to happen next? We have shops being closed. We talked about that in the slideshow where I talked about the Holocaust and kind of the stages that the Nazis went through in these countries to rid the countries of the Jewish population. So we're kind of experiencing that whole thing. So be thinking about that as you're making your prediction. And I will see you tomorrow, Wednesday, for chapter 4. We'll do a quick review of chapter 3, and then we'll go on to chapter 4. Remember, predicting, thinking ahead, what could happen next, and swastika, the Nazi symbol or emblem. And I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.